Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
Hey, Steph.
Hey, Sarah.
What you reading?
I'm not reading anything right now. I'm reading The Myth of Normal, but like very few and far between. Why?
Just making conversation. What do you mean, why? Why do we talk about anything,
Very
Steph?
accusatory. Because you usually link your question to the episode topic, and this one doesn't.
It doesn't at all. No. Has anybody died recently?
No, but my dad's best friend since he was 3 years old is currently. It's been a big thing in our family, but not in a personal. Can we start over?
No.
Why?
Because. Why do you want to start over?
I don't know. Because I can't get my words out. No one's died for me recently.
How many losses?
Oh, my grandma died.
You can't get your words out of it, can you? Did you lie about dying? She's on a beach in Mexico, really.
Yeah, right. No, my grandma passed away in March.
Because we're kind of lumping breakups and losing people together, and we appreciate that they are very different in many ways, but it's the idea of grief and loss. When you think of major grief and loss from breakups to losing people in your life, how many have you had?
I think that I relate more strongly with breakups than with death. I've had my grandparents all die, but it felt timely and there was peace around it. It wasn't sudden. My uncle died at an early age, and my grandfather died when I was young too. But grief as far as that kind of loss, I don't think has hit me quite as hard yet. When my dog died, actually, that was a really, really, really hard one for me. But relationship losses hit me harder. How many? 3.
3 breakups that hit you hard.
And the loss of a friendship, which was there was a lot of grief in that.
That's a really good point, because the moment you said that, I've got one of those that was really big for me as well.
And I know you have more substantial grief.
Well, I've lost a parent. I've lost my mum, which is in one way the natural order of things, but I was 28 when she died, which is pretty young to lose your mum, but there are people out there who lose parents much younger than that as well. And when she died, that was already one of the darkest times. It was the darkest year for me. It was 2010. And it was the darkest year for me. They just found the brain tumor. I had surgery on the tumor in June. And then we found out towards the end of August that my mum wouldn't see Christmas. And that year itself was a bit of a blur. 2011 afterwards was when I hit probably my lowest point with my eating disorder. And I remember after my mum died, it not really feeling very real. My mum lived down in Bournemouth. I was living in London. So whenever I was in London, it just didn't feel true. So it didn't feel like something that was constantly with me, like I think some people have after a big loss like that. After she died, my bulimia was at the worst it ever was for probably 6 months. And I did not associate that to my grief at the time at all. That was completely unrelated as far as I was concerned. Amazing how we see things differently looking back. I just wasn't processing something. And the bulimia at that time was a way of trying to manage that, maybe, or hold the grief at bay. In terms of breakups, when I was trying to think of this earlier, I don't think I've had any breakups that have really knocked me, because the breakups that I've had have been breakups I've wanted them to happen, which hasn't meant that there hasn't been sadness and some difficulty in moving on from that, but it's very different to what I imagine if you are broken up with and what I might have done with that at the time in terms of what I made it meant about me, and then how that might have played out with food. I remember when I was 14, I was not struggling with food at this time. I had a pretty healthy relationship with food at the time, breaking up with my then boyfriend. And it was half term from school. So you have a week off between. Do you have half term? Do you call it half term?
Well, what is it? We don't call it that.
So between summer and Christmas, there's a week in the middle of those two where you have a week off.
No, we don't have that.
So the kids would go back after the summer and they would stay at school like every week until Christmas.
Thanksgiving, which is like a little fall break at the end of November. And there's a little, usually in October, there's a 3-day weekend, but not anything long. No.
Okay. So we have a half term. So in the middle of the term, there's a week off. And so we'd split up just before that half term. And I remember watching the Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth in.
Yeah.
And that's like 6 hours. I think I watched it about 4 times over that week. And I maybe went through, I mean, this is absolutely nothing now. I think I went through 2 tubs of ice cream in a week, which it wasn't a big deal at the time. I didn't think of it as anything. But I remember looking back and going, oh, I watched this and ate ice cream, and that's what you're supposed to do after a breakup. There was no judgment. Right? It was just like, this is what you do. And that's what I did.
Every movie says so.
Yeah.
It's weird talking about this because what I'm referring to is these grief of relationships weren't even what I think maybe people would think of when you first hear it. So my attachment issues were deep. And so I was always seeking, I don't want to say I was seeking men. It wasn't like that. It was like I would lob on to one person. There was this person that became my world, and it wasn't reciprocal. So it was like, you're pretty cliche, playing out my mother's affection, like seeking. I would find these guys that liked me to a degree, but kept me at bay. There was always a disconnect. There was always this wall. And the more wall, the more I loved them. And I became like, I was obsessed with them as I eventually was with food. It was the same thing. And so there was a relationship with these people, but it was me chasing. It was me. I was more invested. I was more attached. And that was part of the fun. That was part of, I think, what kept that going. And so when those ended, it wasn't the traditional sense of a real, true relationship that ended. It was the ending of this quest. And that was devastating to me. Looking back, I don't think it was the true sense of the loss of that actual relationship. It was the idea. It was the idea of what this person was supposed to be to me. But to such a significant degree that, I mean, the pain around this was, so the first one, I hope this person never listens. I mean, I don't see why he would, but this person was this person in my life. That one ended in a very dramatic way, where I found out he was with me and he was with his ex-girlfriend the whole time. It was this very dramatic cheating situation where we both found out in the moment. And that one was very devastating. The second one, I moved. So I actually, I moved in high school. So this was more like, it was sad. I was angry at my parents for moving and for breaking this up. And the third one, he broke up with me, and it was so the wrong relationship to begin with. But in all the scenarios, my reaction was to restrict food and then to ultimately binge on it. But there was such anger and this desire to control afterwards, and this idea of I'll make them regret it. In the case of moving, it was more like it wasn't that, but there was this idea. And I remember after breaking up with the third one and the first one, that my friends would say, let's go out, put on that red shirt. We'll make him regret ever doing. It was very much revenge outfit, as if that had to do with anything. And I remember being like, yeah. And I remember my ego getting really involved. And I remember for months afterwards, I wanted to use my appearance as the lure back. Like I'll make him regret it. Never once realizing like how absent I was in these how actually they weren't even true. Really, like it wasn't even me that was there. And that was part of their own demise. But food became my coping mechanism in those situations very clearly. Like I remember actively thinking about that and thinking, I'm going to go on keto now, and I'm going to lose this weight. and they'll see. And I would fantasize about showing up in front of them in this different body. And that was like what I ran on that fuel of that promised sort of revenge body, explicitly, like consciously, that was sort of how I coped. It never panned out, but that was the plan.
With the third one, you said you broke up with them? Or
no,
he broke up with you?
He broke up with me.
So if it had gone the other way around and he had transformed his body and got ripped or whatever afterwards, do you know what impact that would have had on you? Do you suspect?
If I had broken up with him, you mean? And he had done that?
Yes.
I wouldn't have cared. The reason that I liked everyone I liked didn't have anything to do with their body. But, and I see the irony, like I get it, but at the same time, they're men. And I feel like that's not their value. They don't have to be seen like that. Like the objectification of men at that time, I know I think it's getting more and more now, but at that time, I think that men could be seen for more. But certainly it had nothing to do with why I liked them.
Yeah. I find the whole revenge body thing just a bit strange and slightly confusing, because how many times would it actually be the case? Not saying it never happens, that it was about body size. That even let's talk about heterosexual relationship with a man and woman. A man breaks up with a woman, the woman loses weight. The man goes, "Dang it! I wish I was still in a relationship." I mean, it might be that there's something around
so.
From a sexual perspective of, in terms of what they have been conditioned to find attractive or believe is attractive. That's very different to being in a relationship with someone.
Yes. I think that there are relationships out there that are based on appearances. I think that exists, and where that might be the case. I remember, though, the guy, the one guy, the main guy, the first guy. I remember vying for his attention through my appearance so much. And at one point, I think I was like, must have been the time when I was the most objectively attractive from that objective point of view. And he didn't care. And I remember that feeling was worse than the third time where I had the plans to get that body. Like when I actually was at the place, I was like, here I am. And I remember he said, I remember him saying to a friend of mine, I think Stefanie's beautiful. But nonetheless, like, okay, but I don't want to be with her. You know what I mean? It was like, that feeling was, well, what else am I supposed to do? Then it's about me.
When my binge eating started, I was in a relationship, and the relationship broke down maybe about 9 months or so, a bit less, after the binge eating started. And I'd gained quite a bit of weight in that time. I'd gone up several clothes sizes in that time. And what the ending was, I think, certainly from my perspective, felt quite mutual. But the relationship ended, and I can remember, I don't know how long it was afterwards, 6 months, a year, whatever it might have been. I was working with a mutual friend as a police officer at this time. We were out in the car together. And I was talking to him about my struggle with food. I used to talk to a lot of people about it in the early days. First couple of years, I really did. I looked at that now and I'm like, I don't know whether I was even thinking about what they were thinking.
Just needed to talk.
Just needed to talk. And, they're stuck with me for 12-hour shifts. So, they can't go anywhere. You are going to listen to my stuff with food. Here we go. And I remember him saying, "Oh, I assumed that you gained all that weight after you broke up with such and such because you were so upset or something." And I remember when I heard that, feeling mortified at thought, what if everybody else thought that as well? What if they thought the reason why I had gained weight was because of this breakup? Because for me, it certainly seemed so unrelated. It didn't change. It didn't get worse. It didn't get better after the breakup. I was so relieved to be out of that relationship. And I remember thinking, when the relationship ended, I remember thinking, this is great. And I can focus on figuring what's going on for me. And so not having to think about somebody else while I did that was a relief to me. Fast forward 9 years and I got there.
I have an interesting story. I don't know if I've ever shared. that summer that I was in, that year that I was in London, right? I've talked about on the podcast before the semester abroad, and it was the darkest time of my eating disorder. Everything was so bad. So I lived there with my best friend at the time. During the course of staying in London, she stopped being friends with me. She was like, I can't, you are, and I've talked about that to some degree too. This was a friendship that was, she was my best friend. And then we just stopped talking. So everything cracked. That was the worst after that. After she stopped being my friend, I remember feeling a loss of that bigger than, that rivaled any other loss I've had. And I hit my lowest low. And after I went home, this friend and we didn't speak anymore. And this was, huge, huge loss for me. That was the first year, and I talk about college being a terrible time. That senior year was the only year of college that was bright. So something in that loss actually catapulted me to getting back on my feet again. My binges were significantly less than they had been since the 5 years before it. I thought I was recovering at that time. Little did I know what was yet in store, but it was a better year. And I was no longer purging. It was just binges that, I was managing. But there was more of a management, and it was interesting. And there is a relationship between that grief of that friendship and what that actually did to me. It initially sent me into this low place, but it actually ended up becoming something had to do with something that got better after that. Which I always think is really interesting, because I think where grief is involved, I think depending on the type of grief, it was a loss of something of myself, but it was also like a freeing of something of myself. There was something about her that I over-identified with, and there was something about her, there was too much of a dependency there. And with that break, it allowed me to figure out who I was without her. And there was a new sort of identity shaping then that I think I needed. And I think it actually brought me more peace. And then we ended up becoming friends again a couple of years later. But there was something that happened in that period of time that I changed, and I never changed back. There was something in there that was born of the worst grief I really felt at the time. And it ended up becoming something different.
Do you know what? If you were to try to put it into a couple of words, what was different?
I think that I think I had used that relationship to hide in. I attached to her, and I over-identified with her, and I over-identified with that relationship, the friendship we had. We were like an entity. And then it was me. And it was the first time and even in my years of college up until that point, it was almost like I wouldn't fully commit to my college friends because I was so still attached to her. And it was the first time it was like, here's me. It was a separation, and I got to be me. So this was the first time that I asserted my identity after high school, which was a significant traumatic period for me. So it was like this breaking away from that time of my life, in a way that I wouldn't have done if we'd stayed friends. I would have kept clinging. So it was this forced new identity, where I got to just show up as myself, I think, without her.
And would you say that as a result of that, you've never clung that tightly again to a friend?
Yeah, I haven't.
Is that a good thing?
And we are friends. Again, she's my best friend now. We still, but but there's not, yeah, I haven't attached to anyone since then like that in a healthy way, not in a, I won't get close way. We're very close, but I'm me and there's my friends, and it's not this unit.
When she told you she didn't want to be friends with you anymore, from a food perspective?
I went right for the ice cream Snickers. I could not cope with that feeling. I remember it. It was like I lost my stomach. I didn't know what to do with myself. And I was panicking. I think I was panicking, and I would just eat and eat and eat, which I already was doing there. But after that, it went really, really, that's all I did. I think I stopped going to classes, which I already was doing, but it got the worst it could. I ended up leaving early again. Yeah, I just ate my way through the rest of London. I don't remember ever coming up for air.
Struck as well, you're this entity in London. You don't know yourself in London. You're in a different place. there isn't something to, I think we need some, or we feel more comfortable when we've got something to hook onto that. Oh,
yeah.
Even
I
if
didn't
it's
know
just
you
a
then.
home. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You can come. And actually, how old were you?
I know. I was 19.
I wasn't even in London.
Okay.
I'd have been 17 down in Bournemouth.
Yeah. I was 20. I was 20.
I think I experience grief around places a lot. I'm very nostalgic about places. And so for years I lived in various house shares around London. And then when I first moved into a flat on my own, it was just around the corner from where I lived before. And I was coming home from somewhere, and I think I'd only been there maybe one night at this point. And I think my friend had stayed that night because she'd helped me move. So it was the first night on my own. And I had to pass my old place to get to my new place. And I just desperately wanted to go back into my old place. Desperately. Yeah. Like I remember it was like a physical pain in my body. And I had to go to this new flat that just felt so alien. And without somebody there to talk to
orient you.
Yeah, to even hear my own voice. I have this thing sometimes where it's like, if I can't be seen, then maybe I don't exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
I went swimming with my friend. As I swam back, my head was kind of under the water, and the light came through the window, and it made this sort of fragmented light that was so bright and it was so beautiful. And I got to the end of the lake, and I said to my friend, I said, I just had this thought, like, what if I'm already dead? And she's going like, what? She says, well, you're not dead. I said, yeah, that's what you would say if you were just a figment of my mind. Like, what if I'm already dead? And she was just like, oh, maybe. I was like, that's exactly what I would do as well to myself. And I remember as well, like moving into that new place, and I moved several times over those years when I was struggling with binge eating, and each time it was like, this is going to be the place that's different.
Yes, that I don't.
This is going to be the place that's never associated with binging. Never. There's an opportunity to do things completely different. This was the time, Steph, when I believed the reason why I didn't cook was because I always shared a kitchen and I didn't have the space. It was really upsetting to find out that wasn't the
reason. Justification.
Yeah. I feel like this is...
Yeah, I mean, it's taken a turn, but I think that like I relate a lot to the grief of places and nostalgia and time frames. Do you have that? Yes. I grieve time, like eras of my life and times, and in a way that is probably been the most potent form of grief that I know. Mm-hmm. I call it, the wistfulness of endings. There's this Japanese term, mono no aware. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but it speaks to this. And even at like 10 years old, I remember this. In 5th grade, like I remember this occurring, this very strong sense of sadness leaving 5th grade. And I remember using food then, but this is before I was binging or restricting. Like I wasn't dieting at 10 yet, but I remember eating a lot of cookies during this particular time because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what this was. I was like, why am I so sad all the time? I was so sad. I have journal entries about it. And I think that this is one of those examples of where this disorientation of self and also, why do I feel this way? What is this? I think sometimes grief, where it's very obvious why we're experiencing it, is a different thing than grief that we're not sure where it comes from or why, or that it's even occurring, that's what it is. The orienting factor of food, right? So food can be like, I am here. If you feel like, what the heck, what means anything? Eating is very, well, this is real. This cookie is real. Like I'm just crunching on. Okay, it's that soothing. To me, that it was something tangible, something comforting, something that made me be present. That I remember as early as 10. And I think last year when I moved into this house, I still get this feeling every time I move and I leave a place. I feel sad. And I think that's last year I got really depressed being in this house because I didn't know it and I wasn't using food. So I think that my depression just became bigger as I wasn't using something to push it down. I was thinking yesterday to myself, I was looking around this house and I was like, oh, it feels like home now. Like I feel so much cozier and I'm so much happier to be here. And oh, thank goodness. And then I was thinking one day I'm going to be really sad to leave this house. It's already projecting my sadness.
Steph, you might get lucky. You might die in it.
Touche.
My dad said something really striking the other day. He said, I don't feel great. And I feel like if I can just find the right thing to eat, then I will feel okay. And I thought he was saying it in a very like non-particularly, the word, in any kind of big meaning way. But to me, I was like, that's so profound. So profound. Because that I really relate to an idea of this unease, this sadness, and this searching for something that's going to take that feeling away. Is it this? Is it these cookies? Is it this ice cream? Maybe it's lots and lots of things. Maybe, and that searching. And also the transformation of something like sadness and grief, which is often around something completely outside of our control. When we've lost someone, it's outside of our control now. They're not there. The place isn't there. Whatever it is, it's gone.
Yeah. I like what you were just getting at.
That if I end up binging, I'll turn that helpless feeling of the big wide world into something I can control.
Yes.
Into shame, into something else that gives me a purpose, a task. Oh, I've binged again. That's my problem. My problem isn't that my mum's died. The problem isn't that, I'm feeling sad about this thing. The problem is the binging. I have a task. I have a mission. I have a purpose.
Yes, 100. Yes. It is the ultimate distraction from that otherwise. My daughter said that to me, actually, should I be worried? She's 11. At dinner time, she looked at me. We finished eating and she was done. And she was like, Mom, sometimes I feel like there's something I want and I don't know what it is. And she said, it's not a hug and it's not fruit juice. Why she said fruit juice, I don't know. And then she listed off a couple of other foods, which I just thought the whole thing was interesting, that they were mostly foods except for the hug. And she's like, but I don't know what it is. And when she said it, I was like, oh no, I know that feeling. It's like, that's what you're talking about right now. It's like there's something. And it's so funny how we'll think of food. I love that she thought of the hug first, actually, but then she went directly to food. But knowing that at this point, she's got this awareness that it's none of those things. But there's still this sense of there's something I need and I don't know. And you could tell how it itched her. I was like, I think it's much more existential than you think. But I think this is something that rarely gets talked about. But I believe that it's, and I think some people never have. I don't think my mom would have a clue what we're talking about here. But there's people that are like, yes, that seekingness, that itch you can't scratch. And that food is often, I think, something we think of first. Like, I'm going to go for that. It's just so easy. Or it seems like that might be the root. I don't know. It's interesting.
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode.
I think it took me a long time to trust that if I really move into the sadness, the itchiness, whatever it is, that one, it passes, and two, I often feel better than I did before.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I think that only works, for want of a better word, if it can be accompanied with sort of an acceptance and a non-resistance. Because if you go into it thinking, okay, I'm going to feel this, but then your thoughts spiral and you're creating all these stories, it just gets bigger and bigger and you're almost blowing the feeling up. It's not that. So now if I have a moment, and I do get them from time to time, where some grief will hit me over my mum, won't come out of anything. If I'm unwell, if something reminds me of her, whatever it might be, sometimes out of the blue, I move into it and I feel it. And I can remember hearing before people would talk about wanting to feel grief and wanting to feel that. And that used to confuse the hell out of me. I was like, what are you talking about? I don't believe that keeps you attached to the person. Like, that's another thinking of grief, like holding on to grief to still feel some kind of emotional attachment. I've never related to that. But I have related to the sense of like, it's already there. It's already arrived. And it hurts and it's a tension and it's got like its cold grip on me. And if I feel it and I just hurt for a little bit, it releases. And even when I've gone through periods where I would say I've been in something of a depression or close to a depression, there's been an up and down to that. So when I've really kind of allowed it and gone into it with that sense of acceptance, I've had relief then for a while. It hasn't made it completely vanish. It does come back again. But I also found that food didn't work either, because with food, it came back even quicker than when I just feel it. And I still have to feel it.
Can you walk us through the moment where that hits you out of the blue and what you would literally do to feel it?
So in a moment, I would feel it, and I would probably notice it in my body first more than a thought. It would be like an ache.
And where would you be? Like, where does this occur? Like, set the scene for us.
Like it's story time. Is everybody sitting comfortably? Let's use an example when I had COVID.
Okay.
And I'm on the sofa and I'm not feeling great, and I'm feeling pretty sorry for myself.
Are you watching TV?
Not at this point. I think I'm settling down.
Okay.
So it'd be first thing, settling down. And I've got a day ahead of me where I know I'm not going to feel good. Ever since I can remember when I was ill, I just wanted my mum. In fact, I can probably do it now, because talking about it, I can feel it coming up. I just wanted my mum when I was ill. And so now when I get ill, there's that moment where it's just like, I just wish my mum was here, And it's coming up now and I feel it. And it's just like, yeah, I'm really sad that she's not. And I accept it as well. If I push back and think, oh, she shouldn't have died, why did she die? All of that kind of thing. That's just going to take me down a whole other path. But I can have a moment where I just feel sad like I do now. And it's okay. Other people might find it uncomfortable. I don't find it uncomfortable. Like to sit here now with tears in my eyes, it's fine. Yeah. And then the tears come out like this, and it's normally like one shed, if you like. It's not normally, I then go into crying, my eyes, and then the tears come. And it's like when the tears come, there's this release.
Yeah.
And I've noticed this more and more. I cry a lot, like not cry a lot always, but the tears come to my eyes a lot. I'll be in a group, someone will say something that's not, I'm not even feeling a big emotional response, but the tears come to my eyes. And if I laugh at something, it makes me cry. Everything is like connected to my tear ducts.
Yeah.
And now I've just gone through that wave of grief and it's gone. Yeah. It's lifted. I don't feel that same sadness. That's what it would look like. It tends to be quite quick. So yeah.
Could not have planned that better.
I think that would be more, I think people would see that more on YouTube, because it's not like my voice goes, because it's not this overwhelming, like sometimes when people are in grief, like their voice cracks, and it's not that. It kind of just waves, and it is a wave. It waves, comes out my eyes, and then it just comes back down.
Yeah. So for anyone not watching, for anyone listening to the podcast on audio, this one might be worth looking at YouTube, because I watched your tears come to your eyes. I saw that entire wave. I just visually saw that, but I don't think you could, necessarily through the audio. And what I was going to ask you, because I was getting at like setting the scene. If you weren't on this podcast and that had happened, I was going to say, how would that have looked? But I imagine the same. Like that you just wouldn't have been talking out loud through it.
Yeah.
But it would have just been this.
Yeah. 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 I can't remember a time where I've sat and cried for 10 minutes or something like that. With my mom. Not for years and years, but it's that wave up and down that comes. And it's okay. And like now I feel really calm. After it. There's also one thing that I didn't go through with my grief is, one, I had a really good relationship with my mum. She was not somebody who, bathed me in diet culture and gave me all my issues. She was a safe person and she was a safe place. So there isn't unresolved stuff with my mum, which I feel like has made my grief much clearer. They call it, I don't know if they call it simple grief, but the opposite, they call it complex grief.
Okay.
The other thing I think of as well is I don't know what this will do, might stir something up for me. My mum suffered so much in those couple of years when I was suffering. So I can feel it coming back up again. And this is my own sadness. This is not grief. This is something else. She, it was painful for her to see me suffer. I mean, you must probably understand this as a mother yourself, how hard it is to see your kids suffer. So there's a small part of me that's relieved that she went when she did, so she didn't have to see the next few years of that. Because I always felt guilty for how much I knew she was suffering, that I was suffering. So there's a little part of me there. There's lots of things I do to reassure myself that it was okay that she went when she went. And that was things I would rather have had a mother for 28 years that I had a great relationship with than some of the really difficult relationships that potentially the majority of my clients have with their mothers.
Yeah.
You know. So in many ways, I feel quite lucky to have had what I had. And it's really sad that I don't still have it as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I might need to grab a tissue. So I'm going to get all snotty on my microphone.
Okay. What's a takeaway? What are we talking about?
I think I might have said this once before on the podcast. I quote it a lot. When I used to work at Cruise, the bereavement services, they used to say that, you know, you don't do grief, grief does you. And I think it's, especially if it's not something you've experienced a lot, when people really get their first major grief, it's really hard, I think, for some people to see how feeling it is going to make anything any better. It's like, yeah, but what do I do? What do I do?
Yeah.
That's why I think grief can feel so difficult to hold, right? It's, at least something like anger, there's an energy behind anger. It wants to push you out, wants you to do something. There's a doing and an activeness in anger. Whereas grief,
yeah, it feels like less control in that regard. At least with anger, you can do something that gives you a sense of that having control, whereas grief feels passive and feels like it's going to get you. The lack of control in that equation. Yeah. There's a difference, though, I think, between lack of control and being out of control. I think it's this quieter sort of, this is so unfamiliar to sit in this, and eating is eating or whatever it might be. The perseveration of our body image is a distraction from that sort of stillness.
I think as well, there's something about making time and a bit of space for grief, because with the consuming and the being busy, for me anyway, it was about trying to get away from this feeling. Like, what can I do to not feel it? And the thing about grief is it seems to like leak out in other ways that you might not realize. And it may be that there are times when it wants to leak out where it doesn't feel possible or okay to do it. You might be at work, you might be somewhere else. There'll be times you might have to show up for other people. And I think it's natural for something like grief to affect our appetite one way or another as well. And, you know, to state something that, you know, hopefully is obvious by now, if you listen to our podcast for a while, is like, we're not demonizing using food to cope with grief. The question being like, when is that no longer serving, or when is the using of the food itself compounding the grief? It's not working in those moments. And grief won't go anywhere. We might try and avoid it and evade it, but it finds a route. It's coming to get you.
That's helpful. Feel good podcast of the year. It's coming to get you. I think what you did was beautiful, and exactly what I think that processing sort of looks like, and particularly about not being afraid of it, right? And having that rise and leak out. This is how I also experience grief now, like this moments of, and then letting it, and then it, and I think that's kind of really what it does look like. And I think it can feel a lot scarier without a picture of that. You know what I mean? I think that the question I asked of what does this look like is because I think if you don't even know, it's very abstract and scary. And I think, thank you for crying on the podcast.
That's okay. Anytime. Well, no, not anytime.
Only doing certain subject matter.
Yeah.
All right, then.
Okay. Do you know what makes me feel better after a cry, though?
What?
Hearing you sing us out.
Why do you do this every time? You're not going to let it go. It's like grief. I can't avoid it. It's going to keep coming after me.
It is. It's gonna get you.
You just give me a song to sing.
Okay. Well, if you don't sing, maybe people could give us a couple of ratings, and that might make me feel a bit better. After all, my mum is dead, so I think it's the least you can do. Yes, I did just play the dead mum.
You just went there. All right. Sing next time. Come up with a song and I'll sing it next time.